Welcome, everyone. This is a live streamed M&I Connect video conference. I'm Pedro da Costa, and we are very lucky today to have Phillip Swagel, Director of the Congressional Budget Office, speaking to us. He joins us to discuss the very timely topic of the U.S. budget and economic outlook. Now, it's not an overstatement to say Phil is one of the most important voices in Washington at the moment, not least because what his office has to say about the deficit impact of President Trump's new economic proposals could have a significant bearing on the final shape of any legislation. Phil became the 10th director of the CBO in June 2019, after a long career of public service that included the role of Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at Treasury, as well as Chief of Staff and Senior Economist at the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House. Just to go over our format today, the event will run for about an hour, with our speaker making introductory remarks for about 15 minutes. After that, we will open up the forum to questions from our M&I Connect guests, who should feel free to start raising their hands as early as possible, and also to stick any questions you have in the chat if you prefer to ask them that way. Again, as a reminder, the event is being live streamed publicly, and everything we discuss today is on the record. Now, I will hand it over to Dr. Swagel for some initial remarks.
That's great. Thank you, Pedro. Thanks so much for having me, and Kevin, thanks so much for doing this, and Francesco and everyone else on the panel. I'll look forward. Maybe I'll just start with a few background thoughts on what CBO is working on and the U.S. fiscal situation. I think it's familiar, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Actually, it's worth starting by noting that today is actually the 50th anniversary of Alice Rivlin's appointment as the first CBO director. There's many ways in which we here at CBO still work in the way that Alice started the agency. The agency is nonpartisan. We work for both the someone's gonna mute here. We work for both the House and the Senate. We work for both sides, whoever's in the majority, the minority, and that's really from the very beginning. It's been that way. And the agency makes no policy recommendations, right? We provide Congress with our analysis, but we don't give them a recommendation. So they don't get our opinion. And that's the way it should be, right? They're the ones who are elected to decide on policy, and we're here to support them. Okay, so that's some background on CBO. Let me mention let me talk a little bit about the fiscal situation, and then just mention quickly what some of the things we're working on. So CBO, we published our latest budget and economic outlook, so the latest fiscal update, on January 17th. And that was, of course, just before the change in administration here in the United States. So in a sense, is a budget baseline on which Congress and others can evaluate new legislative activities or new executive actions against the situation as it was before the change in the administration. And the new administration inherited a challenging situation. Right? The U.S. federal government has a structural budget deficit of 5 to 6% of GDP. That's nearly $2 trillion annually. And if people are looking, you can go to our website, cbo.gov, and this is our one-pager of budget and economic information. You see mine is well folded and carried around, but I would recommend that as the sort of first place to look at for budget numbers in the U.S. So nearly $2 trillion deficit this year. The primary deficit is 3% of GDP and set to remain above 2% into the future. Interest outlays in the U.S. are nearly $1 trillion. That's around 3% of GDP, and set to rise as the debt continues to mount and as maturing securities roll into higher yields. Debt held by the public, so the net debt in the U.S., and again, this is the central government debt, the federal debt, is 100% of GDP and set to rise in the future to unprecedented levels. And this contrasts with the situation after World War II, when the U.S. debt level, previously reached these kinds of triple-digit figures. Well, the debt to GDP ratio declined sharply over the ensuing decades. There's a sense in which the generation that fought World War II also paid for it, or their children, but not exactly their grandchildren. And obviously that's not the situation that we project today with debt levels continuing to soar into the future. And this situation with a large deficit in a time of a growing economy and still relatively low unemployment in the US is really out of line with US history. Right? It's out of line with our situation outside of a war, outside of a financial crisis, outside of the pandemic. So it's just an unusual situation. And I should say that these projections, they're already daunting, are under current law. And so current law has expiration of some provisions of the 2017 Tax Act, and that's a change in revenue of nearly 1 percentage point of GDP. The projections also include current levels of defense spending. And so policies that extend some or all of the expiring provisions or provide more resources for any purpose, for social purposes, for national security, for defense, anything would have an effect on the deficit as well. So in some sense, that's the near-term fiscal situation is challenging, right? We have mounting interest payments and then rising debt and deficits. A little bit further out in our 10-year budget window, we have the Social Security Trust Fund exhausted in 2033. And so that that would mean that our Social Security system, so the old age pension scheme would be, I guess, the word in the UK, would not have the legal authority to pay full benefits. So that, again, we have fiscal challenges in the near term, and then just over the horizon, things get yet more challenging. And it's not, look, it's not a crisis right now. I checked the 10-year yield just before hopping on this, this presentation, and the 10-year yield in the U.S. is now back down as close to 4.4. And it's between 4.4 and 4.5. So, markets don't seem to say, oh, we have an imminent problem. And obviously, many of you are in markets, and many of the people watching, you can have your own thoughts, and I'll look forward to the discussion. The challenge is that with our debt having risen, if there were to be higher interest rates, that makes us more vulnerable to the fiscal implications of those higher rates. The CBO, we put out a product. It's known as the rules of thumb. Essentially, it's a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet that lets anyone say, okay, well, what's the fiscal implication if interest rates are 10 basis points higher, or if inflation and interest rates are 10 basis points higher, growth is different. And we'll come out with that in the next couple of weeks. It'll be in the middle of March. The one from a year ago had an additional 50 basis points of higher interest rates, right? So think of it as the entire yield curve shifting up by 50 basis points. That would increase U.S. interest costs by $2 trillion over 10 years. And it says $2 trillion nominal dollars over 10 years. That's the way that budgetary points of order in the Congress work. So that's, in substance, that's the way that a lot of our analysis is put out. But that's equal to about 0.5 percentage point of GDP. So it's a meaningful amount, and there's a meaningful amount of risk in the event of higher interest rates. And obviously, a yet more difficult situation would be if rates go higher at the same time as growth slows. So then both the numerator and denominator are going in the challenging direction. All right, let me end actually with good news. And I think the good news is really, it's so apparent that sometimes we can forget it, that the US remains a center of innovation, a center of entrepreneurship. People want to come here. Global investors want to invest here. Capital wants to come here. The US economy continues to grow. And the labor market has certainly softened from where it was, a year or two ago, but remains in pretty good shape. And inflation is still above the Fed's target, but has come down substantially, and we see inflation very gradually continuing to come down. So there's lots of positives in the U.S. economy. The fiscal situation is a challenge, but it's not an imminent challenge, and policymakers have time, whether to have time to address it or to take other actions that they might see as necessary in the meantime. All right, so let me stop there, and I am happy to have discussion and questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for kicking us off, Phil. And again, to our participants, feel free to raise your hand and ask a question or place them in the chat. Let me kick us off with like a general question about the issue of current baseline scoring, because there seems to be a
Mhm.
discussion out there about whether or not to assume that the tax cuts are already part of the legislation when considering them for future scoring purposes. But that doesn't seem quite to align with past practice. So can you explain what the practice is and how that's likely to play out?
Okay, sure. I mean, in the past, the executive branch has put out proposals using a current policy framework. So saying that whatever the policy that then is President Obama did it, and others, said that the policies that they thought should continue, those were instances baked into the budget baseline, and then they showed the budgetary cost of only the incremental changes on top of what they wanted. So that's been done in the past, but again, only on the executive branch side, right? So in the U.S. we have the separation of powers. The CBO has not done that. On the other hand, our analysis is advisory, and it's advisory for the Congress, and the Congress decides what their budgetary points of order are. And so sometimes people talk about the CBO rules, or the CBO doesn't let them do that, or something like that. And we provide information, and we are an agency of rule followers. So the rules that Congress sets, we provide the information for Congress to instances, navigate its own sets of rules. So whatever information is useful for the Congress, that's our mission. We'll provide it. Now, at the same time, we will provide comprehensive information. So we'll provide whatever information Congress, wants, and the mechanics are that the two budget committees in the Senate and the House would instruct us on what information to provide. At the same time, we would provide information on the statutory baseline. So what many people think of as the current law baseline, there's some changes from current law that are specified in statute. So that's what we think of it as the statutory baseline, but we do the same thing. And so there'd be comprehensive information and full transparency.
Okay, great. That's really useful. Thank you. Let's go to Joe for the first question here.
Oh, good. Yeah, Joe. Hey, good to see you.
Thanks, Phil, for doing this, and apologies, but questions on tariffs. So first of all, what kind of like limits would you have in terms of putting together tariff estimates with respect to a reconciliation bill? Secondly, would those estimates include things like changes to imports from, prices go up, slide down a demand curve,
Yeah.
inflation, GDP activity, things like that, exactly how far down the road of dynamic scoring, which has always been kind of a flimsy, there are various flavors of it, right? I'm sure you're not going to assume that like, oh, because of tariffs, we're going to have, we're going to reinvent like the next chip or something like that. And we're going to have a 2000 boom. But on the other hand, there'd be some things that seem to be at least quite natural to include in the analysis. So if you could just give me some information on how that would go.
Yeah, sure. No, happy. I don't know, Joe, if you remember, my father-in-law is a retired math professor at Wisconsin. And so I was married in Madison. So I assume your W is University of Wisconsin.
Both my children went there.
Awesome. All right. So no, so I'm happy to talk about this. So tariffs and then dynamic analysis and how it fits in. So CBO does the analysis of tariffs. That actually we have a sister agency. I'm pointing up to the ceiling, not to the heavens, because the Joint Committee on Taxation is directly above CBO in the Ford House Office building. And so by statute, JCT is responsible for analysis of any legislation that changes the Internal Revenue Code. So any tax provisions, tariffs, as Joe said, generate revenue, the customs duties, but they're not part of the Internal Revenue Code. So CBO does that analysis. If a tariff is changed through legislation, well, that would generate a cost estimate, and that would show the dollars, and then I'll talk about the dynamic scoring in a second. If a tariff is put in place using the president's executive authority, and as is widely known, the president has pretty broad authority and a variety of statutory authorities relating to tariffs, well, that wouldn't generate a cost estimate, but a member of Congress could find out the information from us and get our projection of the revenue and then other changes, just by asking the question. And we're here to support the Congress, to give them information. And so if a member wanted to know from us, okay, hey, there are these tariffs put in place over the past couple of weeks, what's the budget and economic implications? Well, we would certainly answer those questions to the best of our ability. And then if members of Congress wanted to say, okay, there's, I'm just going to make up a number, $1 trillion of revenue coming from tariffs, and members want to think of that revenue as part of a budget package, well, they certainly can do that. Even if it doesn't show up in a cost estimate, it's really up to up to members of Congress to decide how to think about different pieces of the budget. So we would just provide as much information as we can. I'll get to dynamic analysis in a second. Let me just talk about one of the challenges with the information provision is that with tariffs especially, we really want to see the dollars coming in to help us understand how a tariff is being implemented. And so things like, are there exception processes being put in place? That's a really big one. Are there interactions between provisions? So there's a 10 percentage point increase on in the tariff on items coming from China, but then there are also administrative changes to the de minimis provisions, sort of used by, lots of different internet websites. And those interact, since much of the de minimis shipments into the US are coming from China. And so we really need to understand how those are implemented. So the tariffs that have been put in place so far and then have remained, some were put in place and then agreements negotiated, I guess, with Canada and Mexico, and those came off. But the China one is still in place. We are analyzing it. We don't yet have, in substance, the final projections, because we're waiting to see how the how the tariff would be analyzed. I'm sorry, how the tariff will be implemented, not analyzed. We're waiting to see how the tariff will be implemented in practice. Okay, now let me get to the last part of Joe's question, I think, about the dynamic analysis. And so this is, and then if I forget anything, Joe, just jump in there. By the House rules, CBO and JCT would provide a dynamic analysis of legislation that has essentially large enough, and it's specified exactly what in the House rules. It's some tens of billions of dollars a year, over the, in any year with a 10-year budget window. Tariffs, if they're done, again, by legislation, they would be fully subject to the House rules. If they're done by executive action, the House rule wouldn't kick in. But again, if a member of Congress wants our dynamic analysis, we would certainly provide that as best we can. Now, we did some of that in December, that if you go to the CBO website, there's a letter it's from me, I say from us, but it's from me, my name's on it. It's to Leader Schumer, Senator Whitehouse, and Senator Wyden, so the two chairmen of, then of the Budget Committee and the Finance Committee, and then the Senate leader, about the impact of certain tariffs that they specified. So it's 10 percentage points on the entire world, and then another 50 on China, so 60 total on China. And we did this is what Joe was talking about. We did first the conventional analysis, GDP is unchanged, and then we said, well, what does it mean for inflation? What does it mean for GDP, and so on? It's really difficult to know in practice, since we know business investment can respond not just to the changes in prices and productivity from the tariff, but from the increased business uncertainty and things like that. So in that December letter, we gave an analysis, and I think it was a reasonable analysis, but we would really have to see the specifics of anything that happens. But in practice, we would try to do our best to do that, to look at the impact on inflation, on GDP, the kind of trade diversion that would go into the conventional estimate. Of course, dynamic as well, but that would be in the conventional estimate. So again, I used the word comprehensive before, and that's our goal, is to be as comprehensive as possible.
So short answer is, on that question, just look at that letter and that's kind of how the thing would go. That's how you would analyze.
That's the way to start. And of course that, look, I mean, as you know, right, the challenge is that like a tariff that stays in place for a long time would set off, long-lived changes and, reallocation of resources within the US economy and across countries, and production could shift across borders. And it's just that plays out over time. So our analysis, like many others, we start with the very long run and say, okay, in the long run equilibrium, what happens? And then we say, okay, where are we now? And analytically try to connect that short run and long run. But it's analytically challenging. And then actually the last thing I'll just mention is we also think about the revenue, right? And the tariff does generate revenue, and it would be misleading to say, well, that revenue is just, discarded in a sense, because in some sense the revenue is like reverse crowding out, so crowding in. And so that's what the letter does as well, is say, well, what's the macro impact of the customs duties generated by the tariffs. Great. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much. So if I could just follow up real quick before I go to Brian, because there was a similar question that you've answered it in terms of the dynamic scoring. The question was about whether you'd score things that are, presidentially mandated but not legislated, and you've answered that part. But then, so there's an example. The example is, so would you assume that the 25% steel and aluminum tariffs and the extra 10 percentage points of tariffs on China enacted recently, would you assume them as continuing and therefore generating revenues over a 10-year window, or how would you think about that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it is a great question. It's, our practice is to assume that something put in place continues. I mean, and we know this is at the discretion of the president. But that was our practice. And so, for example, the tariffs that were put in place in the middle of 2018, so CBO continued those in the baseline throughout the 10-year window. And, we had no basis for doing anything different, that the tariffs were put in place. There's no expiration date. And in fact, well, obviously, of course, President Biden continued most of the trade barriers put in place before his term. So that, in terms of that assumption, it was really the only thing we could do, but it turned out to to match what happened.
It was fair enough.
Yeah.
Great. Let's go to Brian, please.
Philip, thank you very much for your very interesting remarks, and my apologies that my camera isn't on at the moment. But one question I had that interests me about the CBO forecasts relates to economic growth. And the CBO makes an assumption of what potential growth rates are in the economy, and it seems to then use that as a baseline for going forward. But my question is, how do you formulate those growth forecasts? And secondly, if there's a big difference between, say, congressional assumptions for economic growth, which might be occurring at the moment, versus what the CBO has thought the long-run growth potential of the economy is, how do you reconcile that, or do you reconcile that, or how would all that work? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks very much. That's great questions. Yeah, it's actually a nice way for me to talk a little bit about our process with the budget and economic outlook. And the first step in that is the demographics. So fertility, mortality, immigration and emigration, right? So net immigration, we do both. And then we do our economic projection, so our forecast, and then we update the each line of the budget. And if you think about it, that's the only way we could do it, because the analyst the analyst on the, say, SNAP, essentially what people used to think of as food stamps, has to know, well, what's the price index for food in year 7 of the 10-year window, right? I mean, she has to know all 10 years. And so we have to have the economic projection first. And then, of course, to get the economics, we have to have the demographics. So that's the order. It means that our economic forecast is finalized relatively early in our budget update process. So the budget numbers that we published on January 17th, the economics were locked at the very beginning of December, and of course, mostly done, a week or two before then, which, there's nothing else we can do. And, one of the challenges, well, you could see, right, if you, go to the by the numbers sheet, you can see that our 10-year Treasury projection for 2025 is 4.1, which, it's off by, at least by now, as of now, by several tens of basis points. Our Q1 was actually high, it's higher, and then we had lower throughout the course of the year, but that's where yields were, that's where the 10-year was when we locked the forecast. And, it's an occupational hazard of the way we do the updating. I'll tell you one other challenge for us, and then I'll get into the growth, more directly answer the question, is we are providing a current law projection because this is the baseline, it's what we evaluate legislation against. With interest rates especially, that is really challenging. I mean, just intellectually or analytically, because of course markets are determining interest rates and are looking ahead. And so of course market participants have some view about, well, what will fiscal policy look like, by the end of calendar year 2025, and then that has an effect on, what market participants think of as where should yields be today. So we're trying to back that out. We're trying to say, if we had current law and not, what market participants think of, well, then, we're trying to get those rates. So that would explain, at least in part, why the 10-year yield in our projections is lower, just because current law, of course, would have would not have extension of the 2017 Act, the expiring provisions. But it's if you start to think about exactly what we do and why we do it, it's a challenge. And I'll just to say, the administration has, they also have a challenge because their economic projection is with the president's proposals. And that's, again, it's every president. I was at Council of Economic Advisors in the past, I was at Treasury, so I faced this problem. And it's just natural that the president's economists, and again, that's every president, they're going to assume that the president's proposals, whatever they are enacted and that they're successful. And so the president's economic forecast is always going to be, on that end, and we're always going to be on the other end of current law. And it's just by the nature of things, but it's important to know. Okay, so then economic growth. So I mentioned the key to our economic growth assumption. The first key is the demographics, and so we look at obviously the aging of the U.S. population has been offset by the immigration surge that we experienced in the U.S. from 2021 till about the middle of 2024. President Biden took action in the middle of 2024 that substantially diminished one part of the inflow of immigrants. Not still a large number, but it diminished. Then the U.S. economy continued to grow. So we have a lot of humility that we do our best and we try to nail down the demographics, but productivity growth is just intrinsically difficult to project. And so if you look at our productivity growth assumptions, which I'm just looking back at again, the one pager here. Well, I guess you could back it out. On our website, we have Excel spreadsheets with all of our, the details of our economics, and you'll see we have productivity growth rebounding somewhat, but not back to the levels of like the late 90s. So that's if that makes sense. And then I'm sorry, just to get back to the last part of the question, we have a long run growth assumption of about 1.8%, and you'll see that our demographic assumption has the immigration surge continuing to decline, and then we go back to the pre-surge immigration in is 2027, if I remember right. So yeah, that's the basis of our long-term growth assumption. So I know I'm giving a bit of long answers, but I figured this is, as I understand the audience, this is an audience that is fine with getting into details. So that's
absolutely that's our purpose here. Thanks, Phil.
Okay.
I appreciate it. Before I go to Les, another quick question on your assumptions. If I read your last report correctly, both the Fed interest rate and the inflation assumptions already look a little bit benign compared to what we're getting now. Does that leave us in a significantly more difficult situation going ahead?
Yeah, that's right. So inflation's been a bit above our forecast. And it's we had one more interest rate cut this year, and obviously that I actually don't remember offhand the timing of that cut. I think it was in the spring is when we saw it, and obviously that would be pushed back. It seems like it's still possible, and that's as I listen to the Fed officials, it still seems like it's not off the table, but it'd be later. So yeah, so that would be, and that goes along with our interest rate projection is also looks a bit too benign. And like I said at the beginning, just given the debt stock in the U.S., right, higher rates is really a challenge for the U.S. And it's not immediate because our debt duration is still like 6 to 7 years, but but we are vulnerable to interest rate swings.
Absolutely. Okay, let's go to Les.
Thanks, Pedro and Philip. Thank you very much indeed for this fantastic background talk. I'm following on very much from Pedro, and it did answer part of the question. I'm trying to put your position alongside perhaps the OBR in the UK, where they obviously have the assumptions in place at the start of the budget year, but they get the 6 monthly updates. They get their chance to update through the year, and they do it on a rolling basis, but every 6 months for the presentations, they update every 6 months. Do you get that option, or would that be a good option for you? And would it be a helpful position for you to be in, to be able to revise 6 months through the year? Thank you.
Oh yeah, no, it's a great question, and we talk with OBR, we share experiences, and they they do great work, and the institutional setting is slightly different. I mean, just because separation of powers in the U.S. So we work just for the Congress, but but there's lots of similarities. So we do updates. One of the it's both good and bad. Is I don't want to overuse the word challenge because it's not a challenge. It's just something we have to think about is when we'll do our next update. And obviously we intentionally did this one on January 17th rather than the more normal date, which would be later in January or in February. There's a statutory deadline of February 15th, which of course we would meet. But we did it earlier just because we said, given the change in the administration, having that kind of clean baseline before executive actions was important. The next one we would typically do in the spring, and that's because when the president's budget comes out, that's when CBO typically gets information from the executive branch, from the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, on the actual outlays of last year, right? The sort of line by line outlays in calendar year 2024. We would get that in the spring. All of our budget analysts would adjust their numbers, and it is a really fascinating and kind of fun exercise here. I mean, again, I'm revealing myself when I say that's fun. We sit with every budget analyst and say, okay, we expected the outlays here to be this many dollars. Instead, they were this many dollars. What's the difference? And trying to parse it. And what did we get wrong? What was different? What was unexpected? And it's just, yeah, I mean, for someone interested in the economy and the budget, it's just a fascinating exercise. So then we do that in the spring. It just depends on the pace of legislative activity. If the Congress is busy with the annual appropriations and busy with reconciliation, with budgetary legislation, that would make it difficult for us to update the budget baseline at the same time. It's just an intensive process. So the next update will, I suspect, summer is the next update, and the summer is June 21st or 22nd, sometime around then. So sometimes June and September, but I'm not sure exactly when. And we would do the whole update process again. We do the demographics first. We try to analyze the effect of the sort of changes in immigration policy, so we do that the demographics first, fertility, mortality, and then we do the economic projection, and then the line by line, and then of course the net interest outlays, and we look at the composition of U.S. debt, right? So we have an analyst here who is amazing and really drills down into the composition of U.S. debt and what does it mean for our net interest outlays. And then, of course, if the Treasury changes, and Secretary Bessent has talked about looking at the way the U.S. Treasury securities are managed, well, we would, of course, whatever he does, we would analyze that and figure that into our projections.
Excellent. Thank you.
Bill, could you give us a general view of how you see the deficit without asking to prejudge, how you're going to score specific legislative proposals that are coming down the pike. Just the totality of economic policy proposals that are out there between tariffs, immigration restrictions, tax cuts, deregulation. Is that generally portend higher deficits in your view? And kind of how are you thinking about this?
Okay. I mean, so I'm not going to be able to answer the question in full. But I start with numbers. And again, we do not get compensated here by the click. So I'm not like showing it, but it really is a nice product. And so, just the challenge is that on the outlay side, right, it's mandatory spending is the growing part of our of the outlay side. It's Social Security, it's healthcare programs, Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act subsidies, and then the revenue side. You can go and drill down through the different pieces of federal revenues. And so that's the challenge, that the deficit is so large that there's not one change that kind of everyone would look at and say, oh yeah, that's the natural change to make. And so one way to think of this is to look at the volume that we put out in December of last year. So December 2024, we call it budget options. So it's options to reduce the deficit. And it's like, I'm sorry, I was going to make my metaphor for this. Americans, people who've been in the US would understand the metaphor is the Cheesecake Factory, which is a restaurant in the US, shopping malls, and it has a menu that's like this thick. So actually, when I graduated college, I did the obligatory train tour, and this is before the fall of the Berlin Wall, just to date myself. And I remember the restaurant on the East German side of the Brandenburg Gate, right, also had this like menu that was like the Cheesecake Factory menu, but my German then was much better than it is now. My German is terrible now, but back then it was actually pretty good. And so I could order, and it's like, oh no, we don't have that. We don't have that. And it's like, okay, fine, what do you have? And they had two things. I mean, it's like typical, kind of caricature of the system. But we try to be the opposite. I'm sorry, it's a long excursion into my post-graduation travel here. But we try to be the opposite. We try to say to members, we are not telling you what to do. That is really up to you. And so we are just comprehensive. That we make changes to show changes to spending, to revenues, and changes that of course we know members are not going to do. I mean, the changes to the Veterans Administration is in there, and we're not telling members to change the benefits going to veterans. It's just a lot of dollars. So to be comprehensive, we have that in there. And the same with taxes. And so, okay, so it's a long way of saying the challenge is that our deficit is so large that, really a lot of changes would have to be made. And so we have this collection of large changes, and that's things that are $500 billion or more over 10 years. And again, it's nominal dollars. So it's a bit of an odd metric that, a nominal dollar in year 10 obviously is different than a nominal dollar in year 1. But that's the way that that members think, and we're here to support members. And so policymakers that have put in place, say 10 or even more than 10 of these large changes just to keep the debt ratio constant, right? Just to stay at about 100% debt to GDP. And the menu of changes is not like like I said, it's not like there's an obvious one. So it's really a challenging situation. And that's the way I think of this, is that the debt and deficit it's so big, and the deficit is so large that there's not one easy thing. Now, having said that, of course, stronger GDP growth would help. And I realize that, policymakers talk about that, and that's absolutely correct. And we've done some of that analysis that stronger GDP growth, well, it's not, not one-to-one in some sense, because stronger GDP growth, there's some outlays in the US that would rise with stronger GDP growth. Our Social Security benefits rise with wages. And so stronger GDP growth, you'd expect that to mean stronger wage growth, and then some stronger outlays. Of course, that inflation might be somewhat higher with stronger GDP growth. Again, depending on the precise nature. Interest rates could be higher with stronger GDP growth. I mean, it says if non-farm business productivity growth was stronger, well, then that would raise the marginal productivity of capital. And so we expect real rates to go up. So there's, some outlays go up, but revenues go up by much more. So strong growth can help. And that, obviously the administration is very focused on that, on efficiency and growth, and Congress is as well. And so that would have a fiscal impact, that's for sure.
Great, thank you. Let's go to Abigail for the next question, please.
Hi there, thanks for your time today and your comments, super useful. I just had quite a specific question just in terms of the updated outlook that you've published. I noticed there was quite a strong upward revision in terms of revenues over the budget window. Now, I know obviously you're assuming the expiration of the TCGA, but in theory that should have been in the outlook already anyway, right? So I'm just curious to hear a little bit about why individual revenues have been revised kind of so much higher. Is that driven by your expectations for kind of productivity growth, your dynamics for kind of population growth? I'd just be curious to hear a little bit more detail around that upward revision.
And this is so here's the report. This is from the January 17th report, and it's this time we did a smaller version of just to get it out earlier. And so there's normally the most popular chapter in the report is the chapter on the changes. And so, for various reasons, that was an appendix this time. And so that goes through the changes in revenues. And what's really interesting is that the upward shift in revenues that you flagged, and quite accurately and appropriately, it comes from changes to the data that the Bureau of Economic Analysis, so the statistical agency that does GDP, they revised the level of GDP. And so that was the biggest piece of it. This was the jumping off point was larger. And so then, if you sort of the path outward from there was not much changed. It was really the jumping off point. So it's an important point, but there's a little bit of a kind of technicality to it that is just the data revision. But and I should just say, but there's much more detail. And so again, I'm not saying it's the most interesting read in the world, but it is kind of interesting. If you're interested in the budget and the economy and putting it together, then going through the changes appendix, you kind of get a sense of how the different changes play out in the budget.
Thank you so much. Let's go
great. No, thank you.
Let's go to Francesco.
I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for those comments.
Absolutely.
Great. So all very interesting. I wanted to put you on the spot, if I may, a little bit on the question Pedro asked you. And there are two parts of it. One is on Doge. So look, I sit in London. I'm not as familiar as many others on this call with the workings of the US state, but my understanding is that if you cut somewhere, you may have to make, the firing costs, pick up the firing costs or restructuring costs, et cetera. And when you start adding these things up, it's not obvious that you're saving as much as you have announced you will. And besides, the state seems to be such a complex, have a complex architecture that you could have side effects of touching one department into others. So I was wondering if you had already formed an opinion or had advised the folks doing this job on how these connectivities could work. So this is one question. And the other one's, I get what you said about the menu. I love the cheesecake factory analogy.
Factory.
Yeah. But if you put kind of a Venn diagram from your experience in talking to congressmen and women of what is politically feasible and what would really give most bang for the buck in terms of trajectory that looks higher than nominal GDP for some of these spending items, where would you say is the crossover between political tractability and really making a dent on the deficit? Thank you.
Okay. No, very good. And so I'm hunching forward a little bit just to take notes, just to make sure I
Absolutely.
get I get some of this. And if I don't, we'll come back and answer. Okay, so first, on Doge and efficiency, and we're watching it, we're tracking that. There's of course the separation of powers in the U.S. So we CBO, we're part of the legislative branch of the government, Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, and what the Doge is doing, of course, is the executive branch. It's Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, and then the courts are involved, and that's Article 3, and there's lots of, lots of legal action going on, and we're watching it. We're not involved in it. We don't provide advice. We're really watching it. I, certainly understand it, the goal. And as more information comes out, we will, do our best to figure out what it means. And this is not at all a knock. There's no negative. There's nothing negative here. It's just we just don't know yet, right? It's just too soon for us to say. Is this changing the U.S. fiscal trajectory? But we can look ahead and say, well, if outlays slow down, and there's a daily Treasury statement, so you can see what's going on with outlays. But if outlays slow down and there are more unobligated balances, right? So there's money that the Congress has obligated, and I'm sorry, that obligated is the executive branch word, that the Congress has appropriated and has not been spent. Well, then the Congress can come back and rescind those monies, right? So we can see how ways in which these activities, increasing the efficiency of government and reducing spending, then could result in budget reduction, or in deficit reduction is a better word, could result in deficit reduction with a law that rescinds the unobligated balances. So it's very clear, and this would be very normal, right? There are past laws. I've been a CBO director for 5.5 years. There have been several laws that were funded in part by rescissions of past spending. So that would be just a very normal thing in the U.S. And we're waiting and watching for that to happen. And again, normal is not pejorative here, right? It's just these are the normal processes of looking at the effectiveness and efficiency of the government, and then thinking through the budgetary consequences. So so we're watching that, and again, it's completely up to the executive branch and the courts, and sort of what happens and how it happens. And you mentioned the kind of transition costs and things like that. And it would just depend on, the particulars of, each agency and what they have set up in terms of the, any separation costs. And I don't know offhand. We'd have to look at that. Yeah, I mean, there are, I'm thinking of legislation, right? Legislation could make changes to federal pensions, right? There's federal, again, I think the British word would be scheme, the federal pension scheme. So if legislation makes changes to that, then that would have a budgetary impact, and we would analyze that. And again, they'd be very normal sort of legislative activity. So I apologize that most of my answer is I'm not sure, just because it's just too soon. There's sort of lots going on, and we just don't yet know exactly what the outcome is. And as soon as we can say something, we will. And members want to know, and we're here to help them. So there's no, I'm not like trying to artfully dodge the question. I'm just honestly saying we just don't know yet. And there's not casting doubt on any assertions. I truly don't know. Okay, then in terms of the second question is really a harder one, about what the notes I took about what's politically feasible, the change of the trajectory. So one thing I can say, maybe this is the easy answer, is if markets thought that there were credible steps toward deficit reduction. Sometimes people would, I think the IMF kind of term would be like fiscal adjustment or something. We would say deficit reduction. It seems like that would affect yields, and then that would feed back through to net interest outlays. And like I said, the debt duration is 6 to 7 years, so there's a bit of a lag. But our debt is large enough that that it would matter. So you can see credible steps. You can see this is a good path forward. Sorry to finish the thought. Credible steps toward deficit reduction could show up, quickly in net interest outlays, and obviously the opposite is true. The opposite is true as well. In terms of what is politically feasible, that really I can't answer, because that's like, it really is the the foundation of CBO, and this is set by Alice Rivlin 50 years ago, is not to answer that question and not to tell members, what we think is feasible is really for them. And we just try to provide them as many options. There'll be sometimes when we'll be working typically with the staff, and our analysts will be going back and forth with staff to help them develop the legislation. And we'll say, look, we think we understand what your intent is. We think the legislative language you've provided us doesn't match that intent. And, it's up to them to decide, well, what's their intent? And then we might say, well, here are 3 other ways you could do it. And, trying, again, the closer we are to the Cheesecake Factory, the better, so that we're not telling them what to do.
Great, thanks. If I can come back just on your last point, I appreciate where you're coming from, but would it then be fair to say, or is this a European extrapolation projection that if you say, well, rates are, as you said, partly endogenous, defense, we know where that is going, education probably has an effect on your productivity, then you're left with essentially pensions and healthcare, where healthcare is probably growing at a pace that outpaces quite rapidly nominal GDP. So would that vast area be a prime suspect for credible fiscal adjustment? I mean,
Yeah.
seems.
No. It's a reasonable question, and more than reasonable, it's an astute question. And if you look at the one pager, you can see just the numbers, basically match your question. That in terms of what's growing over time is the mandatory outlays. Social Security grows basically over the next decade and then kind of plateaus in terms of the share of GDP. Just we have this, still the baby boomers retiring and those outlays increasing. And then, the demographics, change somewhat. But then Medicare, as you said, is Medicare, Medicaid, the subsidies under the Affordable Care Act. The US tax system subsidizes health insurance that's obtained through an employer. So it's not an outlay, but it's a tax expenditure. So that's on the outlay side. Those are the major items, and then of course there's on the revenue side as well as available to policymakers. And that's that's really the difficulty that I mentioned before. Just the deficit is so large that it's just hard. I mean, I suppose you could have a large tax increase. I mean, this is the previous administration. Their budget would show tax proposals that it's kind of difficult to envision them being put into place. They amounted to extremely large increases in the tax on saving and investment, and on capital taxes. So one can write these things down, but it's just a matter of, well, what would be the impact of actually putting those into place? And obviously they never they were budget proposals, and they're never legislative activity.
Thank you.
Great. I have a couple more questions from the chat here. One is in the latest budget update, you have a significant pickup in income tax revenues in excess of 2 trillion and a significant pickup in spending of about 1.3 trillion over 10 years. What drove the increase in income tax revenues? How sensitive is that to various macro variables?
Okay. No, very good. All right, so I'm going to give uncharacteristically for this call, I'm going to give a very short answer, which is go to the appendix that I mentioned before, and that will go through the tax revenues, and then the sensitivity. Go to our website or do it. It's the rules of thumb. So or do a whatever you're. I don't know. It's in Europe, right? You're not allowed to use the same browser or the same search engine we do. Is that like something? Anyway, no, I don't know. But I just search for CBO rules of thumb, and you'll come up with a spreadsheet. And again, that spreadsheet you'll come up with is nearly a year old, but it'll give you an indication. And then in the next couple of weeks, we will put out an updated spreadsheet, and then you can get the latest sensitivity.
I have another one for you that's a little bit over my head, but hopefully you can answer it. So CBO forecasts have been critiqued for having low labor supply elasticity for assessing the impact of income tax cuts. Some research suggests that ETI, the elasticity of taxable income, is over 2.5 rather than 0.4 in the CBO model. How do you think about this?
Okay. Oh, no, a really detailed question. No, it's a good, I mean, it is a great question. So, look, we try to keep up to date with the literature. We have a panel of economic advisors that includes a wide the spectrum of views and backgrounds, including several, really eminent tax economists and macroeconomists. So, if there's new research, we would look at that. In terms of parameters, we tend to be in the middle of the distribution of parameters. And so actually, I don't know offhand this elasticity, the labor supply elasticity. I mean, it came up since I've been director as in our analysis of the minimum wage, where, the minimum wage literature, it's very difficult literature for lots of reasons, but we tend to be in the middle of that literature on the impact, and the same thing on the tax side. So again, I'm sorry, I don't know offhand, but that's kind of generically what we would do.
Excellent. Thanks. We'll go back to Joe for another question.
Yeah, and
here.
Joe, I mean, actually, Joe might might have more on this.
No, not that. My question was, CBO made a splash a little while ago with their immigration estimates that then was very helpful in terms of like rethinking things and anticipating what was going to happen. Conditions have changed. So you said that, okay, you start every forecast round with a demographic of, with the demographics, but, I know how bureaucracies work. Sometimes it's just a update and sometimes it's a rethink. Is there going to be a follow-up rethink on immigration with the president's policies? What schedule do you think that would be, and how would that come out?
Okay. No, good. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, great question, and something we're thinking about. And it goes back a little bit to the earlier question on the timing of our next update. In such as the longer we go before our next update, the more information we will have. And the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, over the past couple of years has really increased the amount of data that they release on immigrants, both the lawful and unlawful, and people they come in contact with and then release into the interior or send back. So we really rely heavily on that, on their monthly data. And obviously there hasn't been enough time yet since the change in administration to get a sense of what's happening, with the highest quality data. But whenever we do that update, we would do that. We would look at the monthly data. If there's, I can't remember offhand if there's weekly data, but we'd look at that, and we're set up well to do that. And again, we get just great, phenomenal cooperation from DHS and other government agencies in the provision of data. And so we would do that. And we had a bit of this it was last summer, right? Is President Biden's June 24 executive order. And it took us a while to figure out, okay, how is that being implemented? What's that doing? And, we said in the end, it looked like it reduced the number of immigrants by several hundreds of thousands over the last 6 months of the year. So it was a meaningful change in immigration, and from there flowed into our labor force projections. If there's, again, a meaningful change, we would do exactly the same thing. I mean, just try to revisit it. We had the immigration surge tapering off, and so the sense in which the baseline demographics in 2028 and 29 were already at the pre-surge rate of immigration inflow. Just we really don't know, like when the surge was happening in 21, 22, 23, how long will it continue? It's being driven by a huge number of factors, but including executive authority and the way that the executive branch is handling people coming across. So we had really no basis, and we said, okay, it's going to last for a couple of years and then go back to the way it was before. So it's a long way of saying, and I know we're just out of time here. If we have changes, well, that those, the baseline basically already goes back to the pre-surge immigration rate. So the changes would be in effect, for a couple of years in our baseline, but it wouldn't be like this permanent change if we go back to the pre-surge.
Okay, but importantly, it would all be based on data and what
Mhm.
you're seeing, how the data is changing, and not any kind of an anticipatory, like, okay, well, this is how I think the data are going to go
Yeah.
because DHS has said this is what they intend to do.
Yeah, it's really hard. As much as possible, we'd be based on the data. Just because in this area, the executive branch has such discretion and the implementation matters so much. And we're not trying to impose our own views on this, or, do we believe them? Do we not believe them? We just want to see what's happening. So the longer we have, the more we'd have, and we do our best to write up what is based on data and what is based on our projections. And we just do our best.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Excellent. And with that, time flies when you're having fun. What a great session. Really want to
Great.
thank you for your time, Dr. Swagel, and the CBO generally for allowing us to take some of your time for this session. It was really great. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure, and thanks. It's fantastic questions from everyone. And yeah, it's a pleasure. And look forward to seeing everyone in the future.